this was just terra incognito. They knew less about this area of 300 square miles than they knew about the surface of the moon.
In 1869, a one-armed Civil War veteran called John Wesley Powell led a ragtag crew of mountain men into the last great blank on the map of the American West. A 300-mile labyrinth of gorges, rapids, and sheer rock walls, the Grand Canyon. Making it up as they went along, they faced one terrifying near miss after another, all while racing to reach the other side before their food ran out. But for Powell, this was never just about conquest. He was a pioneering geologist, and he wanted to know what scientific secrets were hidden in the walls of these mysterious canyons. I'm Hugh Taylor, and you're listening to The Art of Adventure, a podcast brought to you by Arthur Beale, outfitters to sailors, adventurers, explorers, and vagabonds for over 500 years. To help us tell this story, I'm joined by John F. Ross, author of The Promise of the Grand Canyon, an expert on Powell who knows firsthand what it takes to run these wild rapids. Together, we're asking, what does it take to lead a team into the complete unknown? And how do you keep going when every sign says, turn back? John, thank you for joining us today. And we're really excited to hear about John Wesley Powell and his trip down the Grand Canyon, particularly from a UK perspective where he's not a well-known figure. But before we go into this sort of incredible adventure, perhaps you could give us a bit of backdrop about the Grand Canyon. What's it like? And I know you've done quite a big trip down there yourself, so perhaps you could let us understand the scale and the difficulty that's involved in undertaking this trip.
Thanks, Hugh. Just delighted to talk to you about this great subject. It's one of the best adventure stories in all of North American history, and not as well known to American listeners or UK listeners as it should be, I think. But the Grand Canyon, for those who have seen it, it's one of those places where even knowing that you're going to be awed and wowed when you get there and when you actually look out over the lip of the maw into this incredible thing, something strange happens to you. You just feel just overwhelmed with how vast it is. So it really is a special place, and it is a defining part of the American West. And John Wesley Powell became a person who really defined what the Grand Canyon was, because it was so big. It was so awe-inspiring. The first Europeans that went there in the 1500s took one look and ran the other direction, because the flip side of awe is it is very scary, right? Because it makes you feel so insignificant when you look over the edge. And this was a part of the West, the American West, that needed somebody to begin to define it, articulate it, and tell people what it was all about. This was before there were any novels about the American West. It was before anybody really understood the American West. There have been some stories about from mountain men. And then John Wesley Powell comes in with this extraordinary story of grit and man and wooden boats against water and rock. It's a great story.
Perhaps you can tell us a bit about John Wesley Powell and what led him to undertake this incredible adventure.
Absolutely, Hugh. You know, John Wesley Powell grew up in the 19th century, the son of an abolitionist. And this was before the American Civil War. And this was where John was growing up as a little boy in Ohio, was really not seen very well by a lot of people. And so he was really beaten up and bullied as a kid for the beliefs of his father. But fast forward, he was very interested in geology and natural history, as a lot of people were then, as a way of explaining the world around him. That really took him away from his, the being bullied and things like that. And he ended up, as so many young men did, he went down the Mississippi River. That was a rite of passage. But he ended up, as pretty much everybody did in the American Civil War, and he became a very accomplished artillery commander. And fast forward to the Battle of Shiloh, and he was commanding an artillery unit, and he raised his hand his right arm to give the command to fire a volley into the enemy. And a mini ball hit his arm and crushed his arm, and it had to be amputated in the field. And it was a very, as you would imagine, a profound experience for him. He did live, but he had terrible pains with his arm. And when you fast forward, he became a surveyor and a map maker, and really began to see the American West after the Civil War as a place that really needed more definition and surveying. And he came to that with one arm.
Yeah, and he was promoted quite a few times during the course of the war, wasn't he? He was obviously recognized as a great soldier and a great organizer, I think, if that's correct.
He really cut his teeth, Hugh, on leading, commanding men in the teeth of, war, which certainly can test your mettle 6 ways to Sunday. He became really skilled in that. And it was not only the courage in the midst of a battle to keep a cool head, but it was how to organize men. It was how to bring a battery, a whole series of large, heavy artilleries. Remember, the roads weren't paved back then. So they were, moving things by oxen and mule through muddy, terrible conditions over rivers and across things. So his logistical coordination, he really developed a muscle for understanding that all of the kind of coordination, logistical detail that was necessary to move an army.
So John Wesley Powell obviously brushed with death during the Civil War, and it was a pretty bloody war. What made him, from the end of the war, suddenly take on, this discovery or adventure down the Grand Canyon, which is risking life and limb once again?
The war really whetted his, interest in and his abilities, and he had supreme confidence in himself. So he went out to the West, and he did a lot of exploration out there. He was the first to climb Long's Peak, this great peak in Colorado, climbed Pikes Peak with his wife, and that was first time I think a woman had been up Pikes Peak. And he traveled all around, and it was this feeling that the war created, that the Union had just got through this terrible rupture, had come together, and now was looking to what was next. And clearly the American West was next, right? That was the place where growth was going to happen. And he wanted to be a part of that. And he wanted to be a leader in that. And he wanted to define that. And so you look at the picture of the continental United States after the Civil War, and pretty much all of it had been explored, right? Except for this 300 square mile area. And it straddles 4 corners of Utah, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. It's the world's second highest plateau. This is the Colorado Plateau, second only to plateau in Tibet. And this encompasses all of these incredible Western kind of iconic national parks today, Zion and the Grand Canyon and Arches. And it's this tangled labyrinth of chasms and mountains and rivers, and just that have been carved. And so it's really hard in that area to take very many linear steps right before you would fall off a cliff. So the idea, this was just terra incognito. They knew less about this area of 300 square miles than they knew about the surface of the moon at that point. What really motivated John Wesley Powell wasn't so much the risk of danger and the glory associated with that, but he was a student of geology. It was a very new science. And the chance for a geologist to go see that was, talk about, kid in a candy store. It was the most remarkable. There is no place really in the world where there's such an exposure of all of the sediments and volcanic events and all of the wonderful Earth's history. And this, you got to remember, was really just the whole idea of geologic time was just really becoming to the fore, right? Pretty much before that, it had been the biblical 7 days. God made, the the earth in 7 days. What was beginning to take over with the sign of this idea of geologic time, which was millions or billions, and it would turn out to be trillions of years old. And he really wanted to see that, to touch that. And he became, as a geologist, one of the first interpreters of what this geologic time looked like, because there it was, and he could describe it, where rock looked twisted, like paper, and, this incredible geologic formations. It's pretty amazing when you go down yourself, right? You start around Lee's Ferry, and you go into the Grand Canyon, and you start at the Kaibab limestone, right? It's the top. It's this whitish stuff. And you go down this river through all these terrible rapids, and you look up, and a mile above your head, you can still see the Kaibab limestone. So you get the sense that you are descending into the very history of the earth.
And how did he go about putting the expedition together and finding the crew and the team that were going to do it with him?
Yeah, so the key thing, of course, is you got to imagine, right, that this place he wanted to go, and he had been all around the edges, right, and he had climbed more mountains in the area than any white person had, and he had drilled in as far as he could go. He was really curious. So he did a lot of his homework. He talked to the Native Americans about what they had seen. He talked to trappers. He was really interested. The real problem from a logistic perspective, remember, he was Mr. Logistics himself, was that how do you get boats in there, right? There are no trees in there. You can't kind of make boats right there. So he was very smart, and he realized that in 1869, what was going to be key was that the Intercontinental Railroad, which would finally be finished in 1871, was crossing the Great Southwest, right? And went through this little town called Green River Junction. It was a no-account town of, just a couple buildings and not much going on. But it crossed the Green River. So what he could do when that happened in 1869, he said, yep, I'm ready to go. He could bring his boats out from the east that he had built out there. He sent them out with all his supplies. They dumped out at this little no-account town. And with his crew, he could go down the river. And his crew, this is a really interesting thing, Hugh. You think about going down some expedition. How do you put people together? What is the right person to do that? Well, he had, in his travels all around, met a bunch of mountain men, kind of these cussed guys who could go out and, didn't mind if it rained and it snowed. They could hunt for dinner and stay out for months at a time. They had seen so much, been attacked by grizzly bears. The stories around their campfire were truly something. But he picked those guys as opposed to going to some of the people who served under him, the military guys. And so he had a choice there, right? He went with these guys who he knew could pretty much handle anything thrown at him. That's how he ended up with this real crew of some had fought in the war, but they were all tough, adventure-oriented, had handled just incredible kind of challenges in the West.
And what sort of gear and equipment did they have?
Well, and this is so interesting, right? So he's looking at this, again, from a logistics perspective. To show you how much they didn't know about the Grand Canyon, he thought, well, the river is going to ice over. We're going to have to build a cabin, and we're going to have to overwinter on our trip through the Grand Canyon and come out the other side, right? Well, we know today, of course, the water doesn't freeze, never freezes. He wouldn't have to overwinter, but he figured, okay, I'm going to need 10 months to do that. So they brought barrels of nails and saws and hammers to build the cabin that they were thinking about. That was his assumption. So he went in and they had just a pile of stuff. So they had the basics. They had coffee and dried apples. Flour was very important. Baking soda to leaven the bread, that sort of thing. He thought maybe that they could do some hunting along the way too. And when they got into the middle of the Grand Canyon, there was nothing to hunt. And the story of their when they started running out of food is something to think about.
And am I correct in thinking there were 4 boats and 10 men? Is that the
Yes.
right ratio? Yeah.
Yes.
And tell me a bit about the boats, because they're not what we would think would be appropriate for undertaking this adventure.
Well, I got to tell you, Hugh, there was no whitewater adventuring, right? Nobody knew about how to run a river. All of the stuff that we take for granted today, even rowing a boat back, today when people go down a whitewater river, they row facing forward so they can make the adjustments looking at the water in front of them. These guys didn't even know about that. They rowed going backwards, looking over their shoulder, right? John Wesley Powell, you can see his mind working. He went towards these boats called Whitehalls. And these Whitehall boats were used in Chicago and in New York City Harbor to ferry supplies to the ships. And they could cut through big waves and take a great amount of gear to the boats. And he thought, well, that's going to be great, right? That's what we need. They can handle big waves and all like that. This, of course, is not what we know today is critical for navigating a whitewater river. A whitewater river doesn't need a boat that can slice through the river and go fast. It needs a boat that can really maneuver, and so that a person rowing the boat can deftly and quickly negotiate a rock garden, going from one quick turning and all like that. These boats weren't like that, right? The good part of it was that they were fairly fast when there were no rapids. But the downside was that they weren't as very maneuverable. So that got them into all kinds of hot water, as it were.
So they set off and tell us what happens on their way down.
So, none of these guys, with the exception of one or two of them, had ever really been in a boat before. And certainly none of them had been in a, small wooden boat, with this. They got stuck on river banks. They were just kind of trying to figure it all out. And they got to their first really substantial rapid, which was nothing like what they would see down the line. And it was really good practice. And Powell had planned for this. Again, back to this logistics guy. If you think there's 10 men in 4 boats, and they could have easily had 3 people for 4 boats on each of 4 boats. That would have been 12 people. That would have been 2 rowers and 1 person was standing there looking, right, and telling them where to go. He didn't do that. And it wasn't just for a lack of finding extra men to join them. But he was also calculating that they might lose a boat. And if they lost a boat and they had 12 men, they would have had a hard time accommodating those extra men on the boat, right? So they were kind of lean on the men. So anyways, as they're going through there, and remember I was telling you that the guys he picked were, mountain men, and they were used to trusting their own instincts. Well, Powell had this whole system, right? I mean, he was thinking about this. This is this incredible guy, right? He figured out this flag system, and he'd used one during the Civil War, to communicate when the battles were really loud. They used signal flags to communicate. Well, anyway, he had this thing where he would be on the guide boat. It was one of the boats was smaller. He went ahead of everybody else that had all the food and supplies in it, the heavy boats. And he would scout. And they came to this one set of rapids, and he moved over the side. And he did this, what he had agreed. He said, pull over right away. Well, one of the boats, run by Oro Mulholland, who was a particularly, we'll hear about him later in the story, either disregarded it or wasn't paying attention or said, screw it, I'm just going to go down. Well, they went down and they hit a rock and it split the boat in half. They were thrown into the water. Just for the grace of God, there was a little spit right in the middle of the river that they managed to just throw themselves upon. They lost everything. They lost most of their clothes. One of the guys, this Englishman, basically rolled up on the beach. He had his red long underwear, were down near his ankles, and it almost had drowned him. And boy, he looked like he had seen a ghost. They lost immediately, and this was not very long into their trip. And even though Powell had calculated this, he was not anticipating so early. They lost a third of their food right out of the bat, and a good amount of their equipment, all sorts of things. And this would plague them as they continue to go down the river. They would lose things. The cook kicked over the baking soda, so they didn't have leavened bread. There was a fire, and they lost all of their eating utensils, so they had to drink coffee out of their bailing cans. So you get this sense as these guys are going down, their clothes are rotting off. They don't have any shoes because the leather is rotting. You got to remember, too, that they're dealing with these torrential rains, and then the sun comes out and bakes everything. So it's really just beginning to be miserable, and they're beginning to run out of food.
And give us an indication of when they were traveling down the river, they had no idea what was round the corner or whether a rapid was 20 feet or 200 feet.
This is the big one, right? This is the big one where you really begin to think about Powell in a new light, when you begin to understand what he was facing and thinking about. All the other major adventurers, his idea to go down the Colorado wasn't new. There were other people who were very, very adventurous, had done incredibly bold things, who said, no, I'm not doing that. You got to think that Yellowstone River, right, has two huge waterfalls. One's over 300 feet, which is, twice Niagara Falls. I mean, talk about, those are human-eating falls that you go over. So Powell knew that they had to drop 6,000 feet between Green River, where they started, and when they came out the other end, right? They had to go down from 6,000 feet to sea level. Did the river just do that in a few miles? And were there just these human-eating drops of 300, 400, 500 feet? Who knew? Well, he had an idea. He'd been looking, and I found some correspondence later when he was writing to somebody years later. And he said, well, I had an idea, because the river, and being a student of geology, he saw that the river was very muddy a lot of the places. And he thought that time and the volume of water had really eroded those big steep drops that you found elsewhere. So he was gambling on that. And it turns out that he was right.
So they kept going, they kept encountering rapids, and they weren't quite sure, although he had an idea, how bad they were going to be. How did the crew cope? How was morale?
Well, you go down a few rapids that are light. It's very exhilarating, and you think you're on top of the world. So you read the journals, right? They kept journals under the tops of their hats, under their heads, so they wouldn't get wet. And there was a lot of exuberance at first, and this is like a wild ride, and like a dark-eyed girl, they would say, or this is really just very exciting. And then as they started hitting the serious water, they're not as excited anymore. They're a little nervous. You can just really feel that the tone has changed. And what happens in the Grand Canyon, and they have a whole different classification of water. Most white water is 1 to 6. 6 is really bad white water, which will eat you up, right? 1 is very easy, riffles and mild stuff. Well, today we have classified the Grand Canyon, the Colorado, going through the canyon, as an entirely different scale. It's 1 to 10. The sheer volume of water going through the Grand Canyon in the Colorado, the volume and these walls, right? What happens to water when there's no place else to go except through these walls? It has to go faster. And it does crazy things to water. Hugh, I got to tell you, I've been down the Colorado River, and when you see a standing wave just in the middle of everything, just a standing wave 15 feet high, or you see these holes that just suddenly appear and they go down 10 or 15, 20 feet in the water, or these whirlpools, which will take a boat and spin it around like a spin wheel. It does things to water that you just don't think are possible until you see it yourself. And so these guys had no idea, right? Had no idea about anything of this sort. They were inventing on the go on how they would go down. They lined the boats, which means they let them down the shore with their lines not being in it to lighten the boat. They did all kinds of other things, and they were innovating all along the way because they were having to adapt to these situations. And in the meantime, Powell, because he was a geologist, began to read the signs of the way the rock looked to indicate what really bad falls were around the corner. Because you certainly didn't want to go shooting around a corner only to find that there were these massive walls, no place to get off the river, and you had to go through these terrible, terrible rapids.
When they set off at the beginning, obviously they expected to carry the boats a little bit. Were they expecting that to be daily occurrence, perhaps carrying round a rapid, or was it something they thought wouldn't happen very often?
I mean, in the Grand Canyon, there are 360 rapids. 360 rapids,
Yeah.
right? Now, you're not going to portage all of those, right? You don't need to, but a number you do. And I don't think until they got into it that they realized how brutal that was. Because not only do you have to carry your boats down, but then you have to go back and carry all your stuff down, right? And then go back and carry more stuff. So that thing along the river, which is also by definition, this, you're scaling up and down these brutal drops, on rocks with footwear that is just not, and barefoot and stuff like that. They had no idea how bad that was going to be. Mostly they didn't know, I think, that as their food lessened, that how weak they were going to get, because they just were hungry all the time.
And out of the 360, how many do you think they portaged and how many did they actually just go through?
That's a good question. I don't know if I ever finally added that up, but I think they ended up portaging less than Powell wanted to. If they were going to be safe, and if they had enough food, they would have portaged more and not risk things. But they got into this vise, right? If you can imagine, Hugh, it was this terrible thing, right? If they didn't go fast enough, they were going to starve on the river. They were just going to sit down and not get up, and they were going to starve. If they went too fast and they misread the river, they were going to drown, right? So they had to kind of figure out this. So it was really a race. It was a race against starvation. And not too long ago in the public memory, and these guys knew this story well, as every American did, the Donner Party was this terrible party of pioneers that got caught in the Sierra Nevadas over winter trying to cross, and they starved to death. And some of them made it and wrote these terrible stories. This one woman wrote how she watched all these guys eat her husband's heart. They cannibalized each other, right? So they knew that was in their cards if they couldn't make it out in time. So there's this credible crush by these guys thinking, we got to go fast. And then they looked at the water and they go, we can't go fast through there.
I mean, I understand Bradley, one of the people on the expedition, got a bit dissatisfied and disgruntled as the trip continued.
Well, I think it's safe to say that pretty much everybody got disgruntled or worse. He was a bit of an autocrat on the river. It was his way, and that was the only way it was going to happen. It turns out, of course, after a while that the men did begin to realize that he was going to be their salvation, that it was his iron will was going to get them through. But, there was as you can imagine, there was just a lot of grumbling and a lot of came to fist fights a couple times over the smallest of things, as it does on a lot of expeditions. I've been on a bunch of explorations in very remote parts of the world where it does happen. It takes a real person of iron will, and it's not always going to come off very well to people who are struggling for their life.
And 3 of them actually at one point decided to leave, although obviously it's harder to leave than you would imagine.
Yeah, so Powell had one point where he just lost his stuff. Powell thought of this expedition not as just this adventuring kind of thing, but as a real way that they were going to map. They were going to map the Grand Canyon, right? They were taking barometric readings. They figured out the altitude. He was drawing maps, right? And this was going to be something that was added to the annals of exploration, right? And they kept breaking their barometers. They kept all this stuff happened. And they got down to one of their last chronometers, basically a watch, which is what you need with your barometer and your sextant to figure out various calculations about where you are and altitude and things like that. And carelessly, at least Powell thought that, one of the guys fell into the water and ruined the the watch. And by that time, most of the maps had got wet. And that was the moment when Powell realized this was no longer a scientific expedition. They were fighting for their lives. He lost his his stuff and started yelling at this guy and, and saying he had to leave the expedition. And that's when everybody kind of went, oh man, this is really bad. And not a whole lot longer after that, they got into the Grand Canyon, and then the really bad whitewater started. Then the whitewater that just makes your body feel weird looking at it. It just sends the hairs up your neck. You start sweating a little bit, thinking how you're going to get through it. So they got through a bunch of these things, and they lost, again, most of their clothes and their food. They kept getting their flour wet. The bacon got moldy and rancid. They had to throw it out, and they throw it out. So the 10 months, right, they had of food that they started with, by the time they got into the Grand Canyon, turned out to be, they had 5 or 6 days, right, left, right? And they didn't know how long it was going to take to get out the other end. So fast forward, there's a lot of dissension. Nobody's ever seen, challenges like this on water. They get there to this one rapid, and these 3 guys, led by the guy, the 2 brothers that he had yelled at one of them, they basically said, no, we're gonna walk out, right? Now this meant a terrible choice between going down the rest of the river with Powell or walking through 75 miles of desert, right, with very limited food to get to a Mormon settlement that they thought that was there.
This was the height of the summer as well, I think, wasn't it? So it was very hot as well.
Very hot. So they're concerned about water, but there had been a lot of rain. So they thought maybe there's going to be enough water in puddles that they could get. So Powell didn't stand in his way. He felt, the guys who left were not cowards. I mean, I got to tell you that. They were up front, and they were willing to do everything, and they'd shown their mettle and their courage day in and day out. But the same guy that had kind of misread the rapid and lost the first boat, he was the ringleader of this, and he just finally said, enough. I want to take things into my own hands and my fate into my own hands, and I don't want to do this river thing anymore. And Powell said, okay, that's certainly your right. I wish you would stay. Meantime, Powell had calculated that they were very close to the end. But this guy didn't want to listen to it. So they parted amicably, actually. They split their food, and these 3 guys left to go cross country. And it was a sad time for everybody. These 3 guys left, they waved, and they were never seen again, and their bodies have never been found. Powell wrote letters and sent them with them in case they, got in before they did, but they were never seen again, and presumably died probably a pretty gruesome death somewhere in the desert outside of the canyon.
Right.
And so a little over 24 hours later, after they had run these terrible waves and almost got, just almost ended everything, they got through it and they got out at the end. So if those guys had just hung on for just a little over 24 hours, they would have been alive. But they didn't make it.
And they arrived almost starving to death. I mean, they were barely alive, weren't they, right by the time they got to the end?
Oh, my God. These Mormon fishermen, right? There was a Mormon settlement on the river down below the canyon. These fishermen had been told to keep an eye out for any wreckage that had come down the river because nobody gave Powell any chance of making it through, right? So these guys are fishing, and by that time, when the other 3 left, they had lost 1 boat, they left another boat, they had 2 boats, and these guys, you got to imagine, right? There's no weight on their bones. They've all just lost everything. They're basically naked because all of their clothes have rotted away. They don't have anything to eat at all, except for some handfuls of coffee. So they're just jangly. They can't even really have enough energy to really call out. And they have a hard time standing up when they get off the river. And these guys are it's just like this apparition comes around the corner of these guys who have just clearly, and I also think too, I mean, maybe this is poetic license, but they've seen things that nobody else has seen, and that was reflected in their eyes. And that gives an incredible power to what the scene looked like. And so they came out, and they happened, because it was the summertime, in this Mormon community, happened to have a lot of melons around, these melons. And the guys just sat down and just ate melons for hours until their insides were roiling and all that. But quite a scene.
Did the expedition get the sort of acclaim that it deserved within the American public?
They were hailed as these incredible heroes. You look at the end of the Civil War when so many people had died. America was looking for heroes, who were going to be the new leaders. And here was this guy who came out of the Civil War, and he was this intrepid explorer, and gristled but smart and tough as nails. And they had conquered what nobody thought human bones and flesh and blood could conquer. This stone and water labyrinth they had gotten through. But the one thing, Powell came out of it, and he didn't think that they had been successful at all. Yes, they were alive. All right. But the purpose of going through was to map it and to survey it and to share with everybody, what it was in there. And all of his maps was lost. All of their barometers were broken and chronometers and everything. Like they just did. So in the next couple years, Powell goes back to the river that nearly killed him. And they do it all over again, this time with different people. And on this, they didn't quite finish it, the worst part of it. But this time, he was able to take bearings and to draw the maps and to do all the things that he wanted to do. So it's kind of crazy. Most people drop off the Powell story after he got through that first time. The second story is not as interesting, as exciting, and they ran into problems, of course. But what he really did that time was what he really had wanted to do the whole time, which was to map it and describe it.
I mean, it's an incredible story. And as you said, it sort of captured the imagination of the American people at the time. What was the real legacy, do you think, of this expedition?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think, again, in its time, America was looking for new types of leaders instead of the cavalry officer, and was really a turning point as America entered a whole new phase. And here was the explorer, the gristled, smart, but tough explorer. And it gave a lot of credibility, a lot of kind of optimism to the idea that Americans could move out west, and it could, as a country, could understand its what it thought its future was going to be, its manifest destiny at that point, that they were going to be successful. Because a war like that, which left so many dead and so many wounded, had taken the stuff out of America. And this was a way kind of putting that back and saying, we are great and we are going to continue on. And if you understand, again, we were talking earlier about when you walk first to the lip of the Grand Canyon, I got to encourage your listeners to see it. Out of so many other places in the world, see the Grand Canyon. It'll startle you.
I have seen it, actually.
Oh, you have? And
yeah.
And it just takes you away. And what Powell did with this river trip, he turned the Grand Canyon from a place of dread, a place you didn't want to go, a place of just kind of awe, but it was awe-inspiring in a crazy, upsetting way. He made it something that was magnificent and something that made the American West superlative and like no other place in the world. And that was a turning point in America for understanding that the West had these places and these things which made America something special.
And John, you've retraced Powell's route with your family. That's right, isn't it?
Hugh, for the people who go down the Colorado River, and I got to admit, it's a commitment, right? We spent 15 days. There are only so many people who could go down the river, but it's one of a kind that you can spend so long and you're swallowed up. Your phones don't work. Your batteries die out, and you get in there and it's just you and these rock walls and the water and going down and testing yourself really just is the stuff of transformational happenings. And I got to say that it was one of the most incredible trips, and I've been all over the world, that I've ever taken, and had the treat of my family along with me and what we began to experience together and work through together. The grandness, the awe, and in some cases the terror of it is just changes you. And as a group, we were changed in a wonderful way. And that's become such an important part of who we are as a family.
I can imagine. I'm rather embarrassed to tell you, John, that my trip to the Grand Canyon involved a helicopter over the Hoover Dam and then going down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. So I definitely cheated, but I was still in awe of the scale of the thing. And obviously I only saw a very small section of it, but that moment that you drop over the Grand Canyon in a helicopter and see what was below, that image has stayed with me forever.
You know, Hugh, I got to say, any way you can get to the Grand Canyon is magnificent. It's the north of the South Rim. Just driving in and peering over the edge is just something everybody should think about doing. And if it really engages you, you could begin to walk down the Bright Angel Path a little bit, and then you can begin to feel what it's like to begin to descend. And there are a number of people you can walk right down to the bottom, see the river, and the walk back up is a little rough, but it's definitely doable if you're careful. And then there's going down the river into the maw of it. And that's of any way of doing it, that's the most wonderful. But again, it's takes a lot of time, and a lot of people are not set up to do that. So walking around the edge, just being a part of just seeing this great gash in the earth is an extraordinary thing.
I think reading your book and talking to you, I mean, I really feel the urge to. I've got to go down at least part of it on a boat. Yeah, I mean, it just sounds incredible.
Well, it is truly, Hugh, and it really is truly one of the most exceptional places in the world. And I was just so glad to be able to spend a lot of time there in my research for the book and to go down and to have that experience.
Thank you for listening to The Art of Adventure, and a huge thank you to John for joining us today and bringing this extraordinary story to life. If you want to dive deeper into Powell's expedition, we'll add a link to John's book, The Promise of the Grand Canyon, in the show notes. It's a brilliant read. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to us wherever you're listening. Join us in our next episode for our heart-racing interview with Arctic explorer Pen Haddow. This series is brought to you by Arthur Bill. We've been outfitting sailors, adventurers, explorers and vagabonds for over 500 years. To find out more, please go to arthurbill.co.uk. This show was hosted by me, Hugh Taylor, and produced by M. Wally. Theme music is by Nassan De Silva.